The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled Mason's diner as Sarah Mitchell began her morning shift, just as she had every day for the past 8 years. The familiar symphony of clinking plates and murmured conversations provided the soundtrack to her life from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., sometimes longer when they were short-staffed, which seemed to happen more frequently these days. Sarah adjusted her name tag, catching a glimpse of herself in the chrome surface of the coffee maker. At 32, the little lines around her eyes were becoming more pronounced, especially after nights spent helping Emma with her science project or picking up extra shifts to cover this month's orthodontist payment. Her daughter's smile was worth every extra hour, every aching muscle, every missed moment of sleep. "Order up for table 7." Jerry's voice boomed from the kitchen, accompanied by the sharp ding of the service bell. Sarah grabbed the plates with practiced ease, balancing them along her arm as she navigated between the worn vinyl booths. "Here you go, Mr. Peterson," she said, setting down a plate of wheat toast and scrambled eggs. "Extra crispy bacon, just how you like it." The elderly man looked up from his newspaper and offered her a grandfatherly smile. He'd been coming in every Tuesday and Thursday for as long as she could remember, always sat in the same booth, and left exactly 15% tip, calculated to the penny. "Thank you, dear," he replied, folding his newspaper neatly beside his plate. "How's that bright girl of yours doing in school?" Sarah beamed with pride. "Emma just made the honor roll again. She's talking about wanting to be a veterinarian now." "Smart like her mama," Mr. Peterson nodded approvingly. "You tell her old Mr. Peterson says to keep up the good work." The morning rush ebbed and flowed around her as Sarah moved from table to table, refilling coffee cups and taking orders. There was Maria, the nurse who always came in after her night shift, dark circles under her eyes but still managing to smile. Tom and Betty, the retired couple who shared a single plate of pancakes between them, cutting each piece in half with surgical precision. These weren't just customers, they were her extended family. Sarah honey-called Betty from her usual spot by the window. "Could we get some more coffee when you have a moment?" Coming right up, Sarah grabbed the coffee pot, weaving between tables with the skill of a dancer who knew every step by heart. As she approached Betty's table, movement outside the window caught her eye. He was there again, the man she'd first noticed 3 days ago. Tall, despite a slight stoop in his shoulders, with a neatly trimmed white beard that couldn't quite hide the gauntness of his cheeks. His clothes were worn but clean, speaking of someone who had known better days. He stood with military precision, hands clasped behind his back, watching the diners through the window with an expression that made Sarah's heart ache. "Poor soul," Betty murmured, following Sarah's gaze. "He's been out there every morning this week, just watching." Sarah poured the coffee, her mind already working through her tip money from the morning. Has anyone talked to him? "Mike chased him away yesterday," Tom said, referring to the diner's manager. "Said he was scaring customers. Came right back today, though." Through the window, Sarah watched as the man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes fixed on a family enjoying their breakfast. There was something in his gaze, not hunger, exactly, or at least not just for food. It was loneliness, pure and simple, the kind that seemed to radiate from his very being. The bell above the door chimed as new customers entered, pulling Sarah's attention back to her duties. She moved through her morning routine, taking orders, delivering plates, making small talk, but her awareness kept returning to the man outside. She noticed how he would occasionally pull something from his pocket, a photograph, perhaps study it briefly, then tuck it away again as if it were his most precious possession. During a brief lull, Sarah leaned against the counter, calculating her tips while pretending not to watch the man through the window. $23 so far this morning. The electric bill was due next week, and Emma needed new shoes for gym class, but... "Jerry," she called softly to the cook, "how many portions of the breakfast special do we have left?" Jerry glanced up from the grill, his lined face softening as he followed her gaze to the window. "Funny you should ask. I accidentally made an extra plate just now. Would be a shame to let it go to waste." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for Jerry's understanding. He'd been here even longer than she had, and his gruff exterior hid a heart of gold. "You're sure?" "Get out there before I change my mind," he growled, but there was a twinkle in his eye as he plated up a full breakfast: eggs, bacon, hash browns, and toast. He even added an extra slice of bacon, catching Sarah's eye with a conspiratorial wink. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she picked up the plate. Mike wouldn't be in for another hour, and what he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. Besides, she thought as she headed for the door, some things were more important than rules. Emma had asked her just the other day why people didn't help each other more. What kind of mother would she be if she didn't live by the values she tried to teach her daughter? The bell chimed again as she pushed open the door, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The man startled at her approach, taking a half step backward, his hands instinctively moving to straighten his worn jacket. "Good morning," Sarah said softly, holding out the plate like an offering. "I thought you might like some breakfast." The man, James, as she would soon learn, stared at the plate in Sarah's hands with an expression that made her throat tight. I can't accept this," he said, though his eyes never left the steaming food. "I have no way to pay." "It's already been made," Sarah said gently. "Please come inside where it's warm. I insist." After another moment's hesitation, James followed her into the diner. Sarah led him to a quiet booth in the corner, away from the windows where Mike usually parked his car. As she set down the plate, she noticed James's hands clean, with neatly trimmed nails, but trembling slightly as he reached for the silverware. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of someone well-educated. "My name is James Harrison." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, placing a cup of coffee beside his plate. "Would you like cream or sugar?" "Black is fine. Thank you." He wrapped his hands around the warm cup, and Sarah noticed a faded ring mark on his left hand. "You're very kind, Ms. Mitchell. It's been some time since I've experienced such kindness." Sarah slid into the seat across from him, drawn by something in his manner that spoke of stories waiting to be told. "Please call me Sarah. Have you been in Chicago long?" James took a careful sip of coffee, his movements precise and measured. 3 months, perhaps. The days tend to blur together. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew what Sarah had correctly guessed was a photograph, though he didn't show it to her. It's strange how quickly one's life can change. One day you're planning your retirement, and the next. He trailed off, carefully cutting his eggs into small, neat squares. Sarah waited, sensing he needed to talk as much as he needed to eat. "My wife, Margaret," he continued, touching the photograph with reverent fingers. "She passed away 6 months ago. 52 years of marriage, and suddenly the house was so quiet. Too quiet. I started walking one day just to escape the silence, and I suppose I never really stopped." "I'm so sorry," Sarah said softly, understanding now the profound loneliness she'd seen in his eyes. "We had plans," James said, his voice growing distant. "We were going to visit our grandchildren in Seattle. Margaret always wanted to see the Pacific Northwest." He took another bite of food, chewing thoughtfully. "My son, he's successful, you know, runs his own company, but after Margaret I couldn't bear their pity. It was easier to walk away." The breakfast rush had subsided, giving Sarah a few precious minutes to listen. She learned that James had been a professor of English literature, that he and Margaret had met in college when they literally bumped into each other at the library, that they'd had 3 children and 5 grandchildren. "Your daughter," James said suddenly, nodding toward the small photo tucked into Sarah's order pad. "She has your smile." Sarah touched the photo of Emma, surprised he'd noticed it. "She's 12, too smart for her own good sometimes. Wants to be a veterinarian." "A noble profession," James nodded approvingly. "You've raised her alone?" "Since she was 3, Sarah confirmed. "Her father wasn't ready for responsibility. It's been hard sometimes, but—" "What the hell is going on here?" Mike Carson's voice cut through the diner like a whip crack. Sarah's heart sank as she turned to see the manager standing in the doorway, his face already flushing with anger. She hadn't heard his car pull up. "Mike, I can explain." "Explain what?" he demanded, stalking toward their table. "Explain why you're giving away food to vagrants. Explain why you're sitting here chatting instead of working. Or maybe explain why you're trying to turn my diner into a homeless shelter." Sarah stood, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "He's a customer, Mike. The food's been paid for." "Really?" Mike's voice dripped with sarcasm. "And who paid for it? You? With what money? The salary I pay you barely covers your kid's braces." The cruel accuracy of his words made Sarah flinch. James began to rise, dignity evident in every movement. Please, this is my fault. I should go." "Damn right you should go," Mike snapped. "And don't come back. This is a business, not a charity." He turned his glare on Sarah. "As for you, I warned you about this bleeding heart routine. Last month it was that teenage runaway, now this." The food was already made. Sarah protested, aware that the other customers were watching, that Jerry had emerged from the kitchen, that her voice was beginning to shake. It would have gone to waste anyway. "You're fired." The words fell like stones in still water, sending ripples of silence through the diner. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Mike, please. Clean out your locker and get out. Both of you, out of my diner. Now." Sarah's hands moved automatically to untie her apron, her mind racing with numbers: rent due next week, Emma's orthodontist payment, the electric bill, the field trip money she'd promised to send to school tomorrow. 8 years of service, hundreds of early mornings, thousands of smiles forced through exhaustion, all ended in a moment of cruelty. "I'm so very sorry," James said as they stood outside in the cold, his voice heavy with regret. "You've lost your livelihood because of me." Sarah clutched her purse, fighting back tears. Through the window, she could see Betty dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, Tom's face dark with anger, Jerry throwing his spatula down in disgust. 8 years of relationships, of community, of family, all stripped away. "It's not your fault," she managed, though her voice cracked. "Mike's been looking for an excuse. I don't regret helping you." And surprisingly, even as the first tears began to fall, she realized it was true. She thought of Emma, of all the times she'd told her daughter to stand up for what was right, to help others, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. What would she tell her tonight? That she'd lost their security because she'd shown kindness to a stranger? No, she would tell her daughter the truth, that sometimes doing the right thing came with a cost, but that didn't make it any less right. That dignity and compassion were worth more than a paycheck. That sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that let you look at yourself in the mirror the next morning. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its glossy surface reflecting the grey Chicago sky. As the door opened and a well-dressed man stepped out, Sarah wiped at her tears, unaware that her life was about to change forever. Act 3: Fortune's turn. The man who stepped out of the black Mercedes carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. His tailored suit probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, the same clear blue as James's, now wide with disbelief. "Dad," the word escaped him in a breath, as if he feared speaking too loudly might make the moment disappear. "Dear God, I finally found you." James went rigid beside Sarah, his face draining of color. Robert Harrison, for this was clearly the successful son James had mentioned, took 3 quick steps forward before stopping himself, emotion cracking his professional facade. His hands twitched at his sides, as if unsure whether to reach out or remain properly composed. 3 months, he said, his voice rough. 3 months of private investigators, police reports, missing person alerts, we thought. He swallowed hard. "After Mom died, when you disappeared, we thought maybe you'd—" "I couldn't stay in that house," James said quietly, his shoulders slumping. Everything smelled like her perfume. Her garden was blooming, and she wasn't there to see it. The silence, he shook his head. "I started walking. Just walking. And then I was too ashamed to come back." The carefully maintained distance between them shattered as Robert pulled his father into a fierce embrace. Sarah watched as James's hands came up slowly, then clutched at his son's back with desperate strength. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 proud men allowing themselves to break just a little, just enough to begin healing. "Your sisters have been worried sick," Robert said when they finally separated, though he kept one hand on his father's shoulder as if afraid he might disappear again. "The grandkids ask about you every day. Why didn't you just call?" "How could I?" James's voice was barely a whisper. "I abandoned everything. The house, the family, my responsibilities. I couldn't face your disappointment." Disappointment, Robert's laugh was watery. "Dad, you lost Mom. You lost your partner of 52 years. No one blamed you for grieving. We just wanted to help." Sarah began to step away, feeling like an intruder on this private moment, but Robert's sharp eyes turned to her. "Wait," he said. "You're the waitress? The one who helped my father?" "Yes, but it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," James interrupted firmly. She lost her job for showing kindness to a stranger. She has a daughter to support, and that manager, his voice hardened with anger. Robert's expression shifted, the emotional sun receding behind the mask of a businessman. The manager. Yes, wait here, please. Both of you. He straightened his tie and strode toward the diner's entrance with purpose in every step. Through the window, Sarah watched as Robert approached the counter where Mike was berating Jerry about something. The conversation was inaudible from outside, but the way Mike's face cycled from irritation to confusion to growing alarm was clear enough. My son James, said softly beside her, has always been formidable in negotiations. He built Harrison Hospitality Group from nothing. 37 restaurants across the Midwest. Now there was pride in his voice, and something like wonder. I used to think he worked too hard, focused too much on business. But watching him grow that company, create opportunities for people, he has his mother's heart, even if he hides it better. Inside, Robert had pulled out his phone and appeared to be showing Mike something that made the manager's face go pale. Mike began nodding frantically, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching panic. Harrison Hospitality Group, Sarah repeated, the name finally registering. They own that new restaurant downtown, the one that's been in all the papers, and the training academy for aspiring chefs. James nodded. Robert believes in giving people chances. He started as a dishwasher in college, worked his way up. He never forgot what it was like to struggle. He paused, watching his son through the window. Margaret was so proud of him. She kept every newspaper article, every magazine mention, had them all in a scrapbook. The diner's door opened, and Robert emerged with Mike trailing behind him, looking considerably diminished. "Ms. Mitchell," Robert said, his business tone gentled by genuine warmth. "I've just had an interesting conversation with Mr. Carson here about management styles and corporate culture. It seems Mason's Diner is in need of new ownership that values compassion as much as profit margins. I've made an offer that was," he glanced at Mike's ashen face, "eagerly accepted." Sarah stared at him, trying to process the implications. Robert continued, "We're also looking for someone to head our new staff training program, someone who understands both the practical and human elements of service. The position comes with a significant salary increase, full benefits, and most importantly, regular hours that would let you spend more time with your daughter." I don't know what to say," Sarah managed, her mind spinning. "Say yes," James said softly. "You deserve this, Sarah, more than you know." Robert smiled his mother's smile. James had once said, "The woman who showed kindness to a stranger, who risked her job to maintain someone's dignity, who treated my father like a human being when he'd forgotten how to treat himself. That's exactly the person we need teaching our staff about service and compassion." Sarah thought of Emma, of being able to attend her school events without begging for schedule changes. She thought of the constant arithmetic of survival, which bill to pay first, what to sacrifice this month, and the possibility of that burden lifting. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I accept." "Excellent." Robert checked his watch, a subtle, expensive thing that somehow didn't feel showy on his wrist. "Now, Dad, I believe you and I have some catching up to do. 3 months of stories to share, and 5 grandchildren who are going to be overjoyed to see you at dinner tonight." James reached out and took Sarah's hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," he said, "not just for the meal, but for reminding me that I'm not alone, that I never was." As Sarah watched father and son walk to the car, she heard the diner's door open behind her. Jerry emerged, carrying a takeout container. "Lunch," he said gruffly, pressing it into her hands. "For you and Emma." And Sarah, his lined face softened into a smile. "You did good, kid. You did real good." Looking down at the container, then at the departing car, then at Mike's chastened face through the window, Sarah felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep inside. The universe, it seemed, had its own way of balancing accounts. Sometimes kindness cost everything, sometimes it returned tenfold. The trick was being kind anyway, regardless of the cost or reward. She thought of the story she would tell Emma tonight, not about losing a job, but about finding something far more valuable, proof that compassion mattered, that doing the right thing mattered, that one small act of kindness could set in motion changes beyond imagining Act 4 full circle. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of Mason's Diner, though it wasn't called that anymore. The newly renovated Harrison's community kitchen gleamed in the morning sun, its fresh paint and warm lighting creating an inviting atmosphere that drew people in from the street. But it was more than just the physical changes that made the place special. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell," called Maria, the nurse who still came in after her night shifts. She was sitting with a young man in scrubs, one of the medical students who now regularly received free meals as part of the diner's new Fuel for Healers program. "Good morning," Maria Sarah replied, unlocking the door to her office, words that still felt surreal sometimes. The small space, once Mike's domain of spreadsheets and complaints, had been transformed into a warm, welcoming room where Sarah conducted training sessions and mentored new staff. On her desk sat a framed photograph from 3 months ago, the grand reopening ceremony, with Sarah cutting the ribbon alongside Robert and James Harrison. Emma stood front and center, beaming with pride as her mother officially became Director of Community Engagement and Training for Harrison Hospitality Group's newest venture. The diner had become more than just a restaurant. Under Sarah's guidance, it had evolved into a community hub, a place where kindness wasn't just encouraged, it was part of the business model. Every day they served paying customers alongside those who couldn't afford to pay, with no distinction in service or quality. The pay what you can menu section had initially raised eyebrows, but the community's response had been overwhelming. "The morning class is ready," Sarah called Jerry from the kitchen. He'd been promoted to head chef and training coordinator, his years of experience now being passed on to a new generation of culinary professionals. Today's group was special, the first class of their Second Chances program, providing culinary training to people trying to rebuild their lives. Sarah gathered her materials and headed to the training room, formerly the diner's storage area. 10 faces looked up at her expectantly, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all united by the desire to create something new for themselves. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice carrying the warmth that had become her trademark. "Before we start today's lesson, I want to share a story with you. 6 months ago, I stood outside this building, thinking my life had fallen apart because I chose kindness over rules." As she spoke, she noticed movement by the door. James Harrison stood there, looking dramatically different from the man she'd first met. Clean-shaven now, dressed in comfortable business casual attire, he had become a regular fixture at the diner. 3 days a week, he taught literature classes in their community room, helping adults prepare for their GEDs while rediscovering his passion for teaching. "The lesson wasn't that kindness always brings rewards," Sarah continued, meeting James's approving smile. "The lesson was that kindness matters, period. Sometimes it costs us everything. Sometimes it brings unexpected blessings. But it always matters." The morning unfolded with its usual rhythm: training sessions, regular customers mingling with those down on their luck, the smell of Jerry's cooking filling the air. Tom and Betty still shared their pancakes at their usual table, but now they also sponsored meals for others who needed them. Mr. Peterson had become one of their most enthusiastic volunteers, helping to manage the books for their community programs. During the lunch rush, Sarah took a moment to watch Emma doing her homework at the counter. Her daughter now came here after school, no longer needing a babysitter since Sarah's new position gave her regular hours. More importantly, Emma was learning lessons about community and compassion that no textbook could teach. Sarah, a young woman, approached the counter hesitantly. "I just wanted to say thank you. 3 months ago, I was where James used to be, standing outside, watching people eat. Now I'm in the culinary program," and she wiped at her eyes. "I'm going to make it, thanks to you." "Thanks to yourself," Sarah corrected gently. "You did the hard work. We just opened the door." The afternoon brought Robert Harrison, stopping by for his weekly check-in. These visits had become less about business oversight and more about family gatherings, as he often brought his children to visit their grandfather, who lived in a comfortable apartment above the diner now. "The board is impressed," Robert said, reviewing the monthly reports. "The community investment is paying off better than our traditional restaurants. We're looking at implementing similar programs across the group." Sarah nodded, thinking of all the lives that could be touched, all the doors that could be opened. It turns out kindness is good business. Indeed, Robert smiled, his father's warmth showing through his businessman's exterior. "Though I suspect you knew that all along." As closing time approached, Sarah stood at the window where she had first seen James standing 6 months ago. The street outside had changed. 2 other businesses had caught the spirit of community, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the neighborhood. Emma appeared at her side, homework complete. "Mum, can we stay for dinner?" James promised to help me with my English essay. Sarah wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, remembering a time not so long ago when every meal out was a careful calculation of cost versus necessity. "Of course we can, sweetie." Later, as they sat in a booth with James and his family, Sarah looked around at what her simple act of kindness had created. The diner buzzed with life students studying, families eating, people from all walks of life finding common ground over good food and warm conversation. In the kitchen, Jerry was teaching one of their trainees the secret to his famous meatloaf. At the counter, a new customer hesitated over the pay-what-you-can menu, only to be quietly assured by Mr. Peterson that everyone was welcome here. "Penny for your thoughts," James asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Sarah smiled, watching Emma laugh at something her grandfather had said. "I was just thinking about that morning, about how close I came to not opening that door, not taking that risk." "But you did," James said softly, "and look what grew from that single moment of grace." Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of it deep in her bones. The diner had become what it was always meant to be, not just a place to eat, but a place to belong, to begin again, to believe in the power of simple kindness to change lives. As the evening wound down, Sarah updated the chalkboard that hung by the door. Under the daily specials and community announcements, she wrote the words that had become the diner's unofficial motto: "Kindness served daily. Pass it on." Outside, the city lights began to twinkle, and through the window she could see new faces pausing to read the menu, to peer inside, to wonder if they too might find what they needed here. Sarah smiled, knowing that tomorrow she would open these doors again, ready to serve up hope alongside the coffee, one cup at a time.